Lovely. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
You happy for me just to plow on through?
Sure, go ahead.
Brilliant. Well, hi everyone. Hope your day is going okay. I know in my time zone in the UK, we're getting ready to wind down now, and I know some people's days feel like they're just be kicking off. So, for everyone who's here and watching, thank you for hanging about, and I hope that a lot of the other talks have been interesting. You've taken a lot away from today. My name is Chris Green. I am a head of marketing innovation at an agency called Footprint Digital, based in Colchester and London here in the UK. I'm also an on-call ambassador and spend far too much time playing with SEO tools and just kind of search in general. Today I'm going to talk about experiments with internal linking and as much of the journey going through that process as what I've learned as part of that as well, because I think there's two kind of factors to this. So first things first, I want to start you off with a question here. Do you know what a disastrous combination is? I can think of many disastrous combinations, for example, pogo stick and tattoo needle, but that's not actually this kind of disastrous combination of I'm thinking of here. I'm thinking of something maybe a little more muted and maybe a little more boring to those outside of the SEO world. And I think there's a combination of some factors. So one factor, judging the impact of internal linking changes is notoriously difficult. It's always been a hard thing to work out. But when we pair that with another factor that we make far too many changes without testing, it could spell disaster for many websites. And this is something that I think about probably more than most people should do. I have to include myself in, people who make changes without testing as much. And it's something I've always wanted to test myself on. And I think fundamentally, when we look at this, the thing that worries me is changes we make with good intentions can often do more harm than good. And it's not that we're bad people or we're necessarily doing bad things. It's just because we're talking about complex and intricate systems that we're not always aware of. But actually within this space and within a lot of elements of SEO, testing is not always an easy thing to do for various reasons. Sometimes you test websites, you have to create new websites to A/B test traffic, you have to create whole new frameworks and methods of doing things. So we've got our work cut out for us. But even that said, I want you to leave this session more willing to challenge and test your own knowledge when optimizing and working in the future, and maybe even change some of your own workflows around some of the ideas and approaches that I'm going to talk about. Now, one of the main things that inhibits kind of testing in this space is quite often a fear of asking what I call dumb sounding questions. And that's not necessarily always fair in that, I would argue that there's no such thing as a dumb sounding question in SEO. Because fundamentally so much of what we do is shrouded in kind of mystery, or at least unknowns. And if I can kind of pick some of the phrases, some of the feedback that myself and my colleague Simon have received in the past through some of the testing that we've done, it spells out why people have this fear. Statements like, I knew that 5 years ago, which isn't very helpful. It kind of makes the assumption that just because someone knew it way back when, it's no point revisiting it now. Or maybe other phrases like everyone that should know that. I kind of refute that there's any real major parts of an SEO that everyone should know. There are kind of core tenets, but to assume that something's written and accepted universally across this space is a problematic one. Statements like it's obvious, you're talking about X element, it's obvious to us that that's the case. Well, sometimes you need to test something in order to validate whether what people think is obvious is actually correct or not. And that's going to be the angle that I go on. But one more piece of feedback that I've received, it's probably one of my favorite quote unquote pieces in the last couple of years, was just the feedback, bad test, which was thoroughly unhelpful. And it's easy to see how people can get despondent and not do this stuff if this is the kind of thing that they experience when they put themselves out on a limb, which is ultimately what I'm doing today in part. I might unearth or share some of my own kind of lacks of knowledge or potential ignorance or unknown elements, but I do that in good faith that I want to make myself better, and I hope everyone else shares in that too. Don't be afraid of this. As a whole. And I know sometimes some elements of Twitter can be quite a hostile place, and I've shared some examples of unhelpful and damaging feedback, but this has not been the norm over the last 10 years or so that I've been doing this. By and large, we are a very open and sharing space, and everybody needs to just kind of roll with it. And there's just not that these outliers don't ultimately restrict and rule what we do, what we shouldn't do. Now, once we kind of get past that hurdle and we think about, well, how do we make this easier? We do have the tools at hand to start testing and validating our approaches more so than we ever have done before. The kind of the suite of cloud tools, of really cool stuff that Cloudflare and similar can afford, things that weren't possible to test a year ago, are very much scalable and doable now. So this is the time to embrace that. And if you've been doing this for a couple of years and you've written off tasks and questions as, well, I don't know, we can't test and check that, we probably can now, and you should really kind of look into that. And the fundamental thing is, what this kind of testing and validation process gives us the ability to do is just level up our overall knowledge. And because we tend to share as an industry quite a lot anyway, we bring everyone else along for the ride with us too. Well, that is my hope, even if that sounds a little naive, but I hope that everyone proves me wrong. Now, obviously, me sort of framing this test with that. The test that I was looking to run is with OnCrawl. As I mentioned, I'm an ambassador for them. I've been using the platform for about 18 months. And it's something that it's a cloud crawler that works really well. I've had a lot of good experiences, but one of the things that I wanted to look at here is how their in-rank score, their proxy for PageRank essentially, measures the flow of value between pages, and more importantly, what experiments with internal linking can show us, i.e. what's the perceived impact of making certain changes. And fundamentally, I wanted to get a better understanding of what changes to internal linking structures do before we deploy them, or at least gain an idea in what the impact could there be. Okay, but the key one is I want to share with you my methodologies, share with you some of my findings, and hopefully inspire you to try something similar, or at least think differently the next time some of these questions arise. Now, really quickly, in-rank is OnCrawl's metric that is effectively, as I said, a proxy of PageRank. The 0 to 10 scale is still there. What I would say, and this is a kind of a big caveat and health warning, it is not PageRank as Google uses it now, or it might not be. The problem is we don't know fundamentally. So to what degree this maps exactly what happens out in the world is still a little bit unknown. But having used and worked with this measure since the start of the year, or the most updated iteration of it since the start of the year, I'm happy from what I can see so far, and it seems to tally with what I would anticipate or expect. But just to kind of keep everybody aware, I'm not kind of saying that this is what happens to PageRank out in the world. And if I do, it's probably by accident. It's not intentional. This is about in-rank. Okay, health warning over. So as I mentioned before, I wanted to test things before they went to deployment. That's the kind of the approach. Now, this was all done in a kind of a sort of a lab environment, as it were. This wasn't done on a real test we were looking to push. I created a test site for the purposes of this. And this is it. This is it's fairly uninspiring blog theme, but I had permission to scrape and lift the content from an industry site and recreate a version of that within a WordPress environment so I could run these tests. Now, there were just under 4,000 posts by 146 authors across for the test site, 4 categories. And an important thing to note here, it's not written on the screen, is this content was posted well over 10 years in time. So we're talking about a very kind of deep site in quite a narrow category structure, which some of you may already be starting to think, well, there are going to be some inherent issues in that. And we will come up across some of those later when we talk about some of the potential changes. But that's just to give you an idea of what's there. I've kept things as simple as I can for this. The main menu is the menu that you see there, broadly speaking. Homepage and the control just had the first 4 top level categories, and it was a universal navigation element. And the sidebar nav was near enough standard WordPress, minus the admin links, had related posts, and to start with, the categories we were using. We did introduce other elements into this as part of the tests, notably date taxonomies, but again, fairly standard fare. And just a kind of sense of completeness, skipped ahead. Here are the other elements of linking, major linking. We had the breadcrumb. We also had category links above post titles. That was just built into the theme that we used. Not necessarily something I would recommend, incidentally, but that was our control that we set. And the footer had virtually nothing in it, and we left that clear intention. Now, crucial point to remember before we go anything else is I added no robots or crawling control or any form on the site. I didn't want that to muddy the waters. Would have been really interested to test it, but it was out of the scope of this study as it stood. So, I'm just changing internal linking elements for now. So before I rattle into the results, I want to sort of pose the question, sitting there, people watching this, what would you have optimized for the site? Now, almost certainly I can guarantee that if not one person has thought this, I'd be disappointed, but it depends. Because it does depend. And actually, this is kind of a complex issue, but we all have to go out on a limb sometimes. And based on the information I've given you, sometimes you still start to have to begin this process. So I'm going to go out on a limb and I'll say, well, if I was faced with this, what would I do? I would have done these things. I would have added related posts to the bottom of the blogs because my version, my kind of sandbox environment did not have that. I would have certainly added more categories because I didn't feel like there were enough there. But also the breadth, the depth of the content in terms of the age, I would have added date categories, taxonomy pages into there. But actually, I'm not a huge fan of tags because I don't tend to see them done well. Some of you out there may have said, no, I wouldn't have ignored tags. I'd have done differently. Fair cop. That may have, but for this is what I would have done. And we will revisit this later after I've gone through the results to see how well or not I would have fared had I not tested. Cool. So the tests we ran, well, the first one was the control, just to work out, okay, what is the sort of the base level flow of internal linking. Then we added 6 related posts to each post. There's a 3.6 thousand of them. We used a widget that did this intelligently, so all the related posts were related to the content of that post, just to let you know. Then another test was adding date archives, so we're talking about over 120 new pages to help kind of classify and sort our dates. We tried to test removing the breadcrumb because part of me wanted to work out, well, actually, what's the breadcrumbs use within this set of parameters, and then we talked about adding tags to try and classify that. We added 11 different tags, and then we added subcategories. So we added to the categories that were already there and added 11 additional. And then why not? We added all of the internal linking elements together. So tests 2 through 6, we did all of them, except obviously we kept the breadcrumb. So that was the all in. If we just do everything, what would have happened? So we'll go and look at those. Now, one of the toughest parts of this actually is the process around doing it, because it's not that simple. And I'm making the assumption that for anyone to really start doing this in any meaningful way, you need to have some understanding around websites and potentially, for this instance, just, how do you chuck up your own WordPress website quickly and easily? So there is that as a prerequisite. And it doesn't matter if your site is on the same platform as the site you're testing for necessarily, as long as the kind of the internal linking elements marry up and match up. And that's actually easier to do than you think. It certainly doesn't need to look pretty, so don't worry. So the process: first, the initial crawl the site. Let's get our control test in there. Then we make the first change. Then we crawl the site again. We try and register the sort of metrics for that change. Then we reset and we make another change, and then we repeat until done throughout all of the tests. And believe you me, you need to be patient for this. The key thing is that we wanted to capture all of the crawl data for each one of these crawls. We wanted to have them all stored within OnCrawl. And then there were certain degrees of analysis we could do within the platform, but then I pulled down the data and did the rest offline so I could start to bring together all of the findings. And it's not necessarily easy. I would suggest if you're doing this out in the wild and you're actually testing this, I was putting tests in because I felt I wanted to check that. I mean, if you're really just validating an approach, only test for actually what you're trying for, just to kind of speed things up. So some other tips: so write everything down. Your crawl setup, your categories, your tags, your plugin settings, whatever it is, because sometimes these tests can take place over a fairly long period of time. And if you forget some of the key parameters, you will potentially make your further tests harder because you'll be unsure about, well, am I testing, am I controlling for the variables as best I can? And to help you with that, you take database backups off and take code backups off. And if you mess up the site, essentially what I'm saying is I did this without planning it as well as I maybe could have or would have had I done it again. And if I'd have done this list of elements, if I'd have taken backups of databases and code bases, etc., a lot of the mistakes and errors I made would have been recoverable far, far quicker. So just run through this kind of process just to give yourself the chance you have to complete the process properly. But the other key thing is you need to ensure that Googlebot cannot crawl your site while you're doing this. As I mentioned before, I took a crawl of a live site that's ranking and has a commercial element behind it. If that would have been indexed, the test site would have been indexed, that would have been a problem. Now, the other hint I did for an extra degree of security, I used Cloudflare's own firewall to block Googlebot or anyone that didn't have a user agent with a specific string in it. Now, in the example in the image, I've just used my name, but this data can be fed into OnCrawl and other crawlers. So Cloudflare will only let people accessing the website with the right user agent. So again, if you're really worried about security and you don't want to get into messing around with other kind of more intricate elements, the Cloudflare's firewall can help well. Just be aware that if you configure this wrong, you can block other websites. So word to the wise, make sure you know what you're checking. Right, so that's enough of me prattling on about the setup. Let's talk about the results. I'm going to take a cherry pick and skim the top level of these, but we'll just give you a feel for what we saw in the analysis. So the first thing I looked at was the average in rank by page level. So on average, does changing the internal linking elements mean that those pages at any given level are stronger? And how does that fare, and what's the distribution of that? So here you can see here I've plotted all of the tests side by side. First thing that's a bit of a standout, despite my slightly suspect choice of color palette, is this particular test here, which was the date sidebar, was the significant underperformer of all of them. And if you remember, that's me adding, the sort of month pages for every month of every year that content has been published on within that sidebar. That has quite a significant negative impact on the average in rank by page level overall, and that's quite obvious. Everything else, broadly speaking, had the groupings in the average in rank per level was similar, but we noticed that the all test at page level 3, that starts to drop off, and we'll kind of talk about that relationship later on. But key ones, we have a standout underperformer already within this view. And the next level, so when we're talking about internal linking and changes, one of the things that I want to look at is not just the in rank per page level, but also the page depth, because I think having pages closer through obviously is stronger and worth considering, and it is a good thing to kind of optimize and think about doing. So we also looked at, well, how did these tests relate in that regard? And we had 3 tests that did significantly better at bringing pages closer to the root. The related posts, the date sidebar, and then the everything test. And you'll see the everything test cropping up a lot here, because it makes sense that anything that happens that changes any elements at a large degree will probably also happen to test everything, test 7. So we might start to disregard that later on. Now, the really important thing to note, for every other test, 90% of the content was still more than 5 levels deep. And let's make the assumption that we want these pages to have the ability to rank well. That still feels too deep. So there's a balancing act that we need to play here, and we're looking at this trade-off between how quickly a search engine user can access a page versus how much value is then passed to that page. And then if we look at another dimensional way of viewing this, we just looked at the median in rank and page depth and how they actually correlated. And again, it makes a balanced view of how do we optimize these together. Now, really interestingly, for this one, the date sidebar actually did the best job at reducing page depth on average, which is pretty significantly, especially against the control. But actually, it's also, if you see the date sidebar, also had the worst or the most negative impact to the actual average in rank per page. So whilst we did a great job at bringing pages closer to the root of the website, it didn't do that good a job. In fact, it did a really poor job at maintaining the level of in-rank flowing to those pages. So effectively, we've created a load more kind of pages or content that's diluted the overall flow. On the opposite, if we look at the top performer at this level, the related posts, well, it increased the median page depth quite well, not the highest performing, it fell behind the date sidebar, but also the median in rank to those pages was the highest. So you can see that as a change goes, I would err on the side of that change if I wanted to optimize the internal linking within that way. Now, if we look at those 2 tests together side by side in a bit more detail, seeing actually what's the in rank per page level, this is the 2 tests overlaid. But if we break it down and say, well, this is the date sidebar, and you see the lines on the screen kind of give you a bit of an idea of where I want you to focus our attention now. So page depth level 2, we can see the spread of in rank from 10 through to just under 2. That's a really big spread there. So some of these pages that are really easily accessible are still don't have a lot of in rank, whereas you look to page 3, we can see that that cluster is much kind of tighter, but it's significantly lower, and it's dropped off quite quickly. Then level 4 and level 5 and 6, etc. the in rank per page depth drops off to almost nothing, from page level 4 onwards. We compare that to our related tests post, and what that then does is immediately you can see, if I switch back and forward a few times, related posts had a higher in rank level overall. But more importantly, if I superimpose these blue arrows, the lowest point of average in rank for page level 2 on the related test post is still far higher than it was for the date sidebar post. So these groupings are tighter and they're higher, and the limits are better. So we're seeing that overall, whatever way we want to slice this, the related posts seem to give a more positive impact overall. And this sharp drop off of average in rank per level is far slower. So we're still conveying more and more value to page depths 4, 5, 6, etc. than we were. So it just gives you an idea of this is a much more healthier kind of test in terms of the parameters that we're setting. Yeah, so it's just a kind of caution with elements of this is don't look necessarily at totals, look at averages and start breaking the averages down by section, because again, large sites like this, some of the key findings may be hidden or made murky by not looking specifically enough. And in that vein, in that kind of, let's dig down into category pages to start with. Now, category page tests were, broadly speaking, disappointing or uneventful, I guess, relative to what I'd anticipated or hoped for, maybe. So if we look at the percentage difference from control of in rank, we can see that, well, the date sidebar and the all were the significant underperformance. They had the greatest deviation. But then if we look at the subcategories, they did reasonably well. And then, rather perplexingly, removing the breadcrumb seemed to have a positive impact, albeit a small one. And I don't have an answer for that ultimately, and I wish I did, but that's still something that we're kind of working on looking into, because again, it's just getting an idea of, okay, well, what's actually regulating that? But again, when you look at that previous slide and you see how many of these tests fall into negative difference from control, is additional linking bad for categories? And that's a difficult question to answer, but if we start looking at average differences, mean and modal, well, at an actual page by page level, the differences aren't that great. Even the worst performing, which is the date sidebar, was still -4%, which isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things. But if we look at the greatest improvement, which is without breadcrumb, which was roughly near 2%, again, that's still not a massive improvement. So for the purpose of this, I'd say this is fairly inconclusive. It doesn't seem to cause a significant issue, but it doesn't cause enough of a benefit that I'd be running to change it either. And again, I don't understand why removing breadcrumbs had a positive impact here, and I'm certainly not recommending that we do that, so treat with care. What's the impact on posts then? So keep moving on. So we'll return to in rank and page depth on the same graph for comparison. Well, posts are 3/5 of the site content here, so whatever happens in posts is going to drive the overall site averages quite a lot. But this data is slightly different from the graph that we saw earlier, in that related posts shine even sort of brighter with regards to the level of median in rank per post relative to everything else. So not only did we significantly reduce the average page depth relative to the control and most of the other tests, but we also increased the in rank to each of them, more so than any, which is quite strong. It's quite a significant difference here, I believe. Now, by contrast, the date sidebar, whilst it did do the best job at reducing the median page depth, the detriment to median in rank was far higher than before. And one of the theories behind this, and it's something that I still need to investigate further, is whether creating far more taxonomy pages, again, we're just diluting the site. We're creating more pages to list content for more pages, and it's clearly that's stealing focus away from the most important things on the site, which is the posts, not the taxonomies themselves. Oh yeah, and I had a little bit of fun kind of labeling the winner and the loser here with emojis, but you can clearly see in this scenario which one I favored. Okay, so some closing thoughts, and as I said, I skimmed through a lot of the findings in quite mainly not to bore you all to death, but there's an ebook out in the world for that, and if anyone wants to talk to me more about the tests themselves, please do. I would encourage it. But let's return to this original criteria before. So what would I have done? I would have added related posts. Well, I'm going to give myself a tick for that because that seems to be probably one of the best performing tests out of the lot. So good start. I would have added more categories. Now that added a slight, ever so slight negative impact. So much so that I didn't feel like I could award myself a tick for that being the right thing to do. I added date taxonomies, which again was, looking at the test, probably one of the worst things we could have done within this sphere. So that's a big nope. And I ignored tags, which I can kind of give myself a flimsy tick for because the tags didn't really confer a lot of benefit in this test. So broadly speaking, we're looking at a 50-50 split here in terms of what I got right versus what I got wrong, except that what I got wrong, adding these date taxonomy in the way that I did probably would have wiped out any real benefit that the good stuff would have conferred. So coming back to my statement right at the beginning, changes we make in good faith can often do more harm than good. There is a potential that my approach to this, or certainly my kind of going out on a limb here, would have been a bad thing. So, and everyone needs this wake up call occasionally, because sometimes we don't know as much as we think we do. Now, to be fair to myself and actually how I implemented some of these things, some of the elements probably would have done better with better planning. And I say probably, they almost certainly would have. And there were other issues with the site and the structure and the template that again could have helped. But those were constant across all of the tests. So we could have done more and better with it. In particular, categories, they are hugely important, and so are tags. So they can have positive impacts beyond just measuring for what we were measuring for in this test. And we could have actually built the category and tag structures better and had better categorization and to really leverage some of that internal linking flow. And equally, for a site this deep with 10 years worth of content, we need some kind of data archive system. So something maybe more sophisticated may have been useful here rather than just out of the box WordPress. And I'm certainly not saying ignore data archives in the future. Just think of a better way to introduce them. And of course, I've still missed all of the other things I didn't test. I didn't test the impact of robots.txt directives or contextual linking additions, or what happens with canonical tags or no follows or even redirects. All of these elements actually on a day-to-day SEO perspective, what impacts your site performance, this stuff is all really, really, really important too. I've only really checked one dimension of the overall mix. And that's without saying that I need another blog. What happens when we look at e-commerce too? I'd say there's some probably really, really, really interesting stuff that we could experiment there. And it's something that I'm actually planning of running in the very near future, just because I want to see what happens. So key thing is go out and test it. Create a basic proxy for a website you're working on and check for relative change to what is there already. See if you can get an idea of your internal linking changes or architectural changes or whatever changes you're planning. What impact do they have in a lab environment, in a lab situation? Use on crawl or there are plenty of other crawling platforms out there that can do similar. So I would just urge you to get that testing mindset and go do it. And what I've been talking about today, these aren't rules. They're not necessarily really even recommendations. These are just food for thought. And the answer is it does really depend. Just because I've pointed out that certain things worked really badly in this scenario doesn't necessarily mean it will be for you. This is for the site that I'm working on today. So please keep that in mind. And my final thoughts really is, be excellent to each other. And to all you still out there, thanks for listening.